Welcome to the Grizzly Beat, a podcast of Grizzly Times and Louisa Wilcox, where we interview scientific experts, managers, Native Americans, writers, and others to share their knowledge, perspectives, and experience. This comes at a time of enormous interest in the grizzly bear's future as the government proposes to remove federal protections, and citizens are asking important questions. We hope the information shared here will help listeners shape their own answers.
This is Louisa Wilcox with the Grizzly Times, and I'm delighted to be here today with former Congressman from Montana, Pat Williams, who is a champion of education, the arts, the environment, freedom of speech, working families, and he served from 1979 to 1997 as a U.S. representative from the state of Montana, the longest anyone has served from the state of Montana. Pat is now a senior fellow and legislative policy associate for the Center for the Rocky Mountain West. He serves on a slew of boards that I need not mention. And thanks so much here, Pat, for joining me today.
And among those accolades should be, I know you, Louisa Wilcox, and that says something about my choice in good people.
Well, thank you, Pat. So I've been listening to some of your interviews that are wonderful. You clearly have the storyteller gene. And in one, you said that you didn't come to Congress as a conservationist, but you left as one. And maybe you can talk about why and how that happened.
Well, I came to the Congress as a Butte guy, and Butte people, interestingly enough, came to the conservation, the environmental understanding and legacy a little late, because jobs were always at the forefront of the Butte economy. And so I can't really say I was a conservationist or an environmentalist when I got to Congress, although I was very interested in environmentalism. When I got to the Congress, I quickly picked up on the fact that the extractive corporations had one view, and most Montanans had a different view of what we could do with the public land, whether we should drill it and blast it and scoop it, or whether we should try to preserve it. And it did seem to me growing up in Butte that maybe we had drilled and scooped enough, at least in one city. Mm-hmm. And so then it was fairly easy for me to see which way I was going. Mm-hmm.
Well, you spent many years trying to pass a statewide wilderness bill for Montana. I mean, you did protect the Lee Metcalf wilderness and the Greater Yellowstone. Thank you so much for that, as well as the rattlesnake. And you saved the Bob Marshall from drilling and oil and gas development that James Watt, then Secretary of Interior, was all about trying to do. And it was over wilderness that our paths first crossed in the 1980s when I served as a program director back in the day for the Greater Yellowstone Coalition. And I went back to D.C. countless times, and your office was always open, and your staff, and you were always ready to talk about wilderness. And you knew so much about each and every area that we were discussing in a large state. Why did you put so much skin into that game of protecting Montana wilderness?
Well, because I had become aware that the wild public lands were shrinking. I think Lee Metcalf, former senator, great senator, Lee Metcalf's term was melting like a snowball on a July day. Yeah. And, once you get a whole look, a grand vision of the public lands, their potential, the dangers to them, as you do if you're really engaged with environmentalism out this way, or if you get to Washington and you're able to get a broad look at it through your committee assignments, then it seems to me you can more easily come to your senses about what should be done. And another thing occurred to me, though, Louisa, in the 1980s. Butte was in a lot of trouble. Mm-hmm. The pit had closed. It was becoming, I was becoming aware of a changing Montana economy. It wasn't obvious in those early 80s, but it seemed to me there was a certain inevitability to the fact that we were going to go as a state from one type of a prime economy to another kind of prime economy. And the truth of it was, now looking back, we moved from an extractive economy to something else, to a conservation or a tourism economy. It's a different kind of an economy that produced more jobs, by the way, than the extractive economy had produced during the last 75 years or so. And so I chose to be on the House Natural Resources Committee. In those days, as you remember, it was called Interior, and Morris Udall was chairman of the full committee, and a wonderful fellow named John Seiberling was chairman of the subcommittee. I got on those two, got on the full committee, and then of course by dint of membership of the full committee, I became a member of that subcommittee, which was National Parks and Public Lands. So here was a young congressman from Montana that had all these wild but undesignated places, unprotected places virtually, and it was my task to figure out how to protect them, and how to allow industry to use what was available to them that was legitimate harvest, and so away I went.
Well, it was pretty prescient to actually anticipate in the early 80s what the economies of, especially in western Montana around Yellowstone, Glacier, and Missoula, what they were going to look like. And they have been through this sort of bottleneck of a transition to much more tourism, people settling here, opening businesses here who want to fish the rivers and climb the mountains and see wildlife. I mean, we really have been through kind of a major transformation economically.
We really have, and it has shifted priorities in the Rocky Mountain West, and particularly in states such as Montana that were so heavily dependent, at least in western Montana, on the extractable resource. Eastern Montana is depending on the resource too, but it's farming. Out here it was extraction. And, it just seemed to me that those days were going, and now, not gone, but in a much different economic condition than they were in the early 80s, 70s, 60s, 50s, and way back. All the way to the 1890s.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, we have some of the biggest, wildest places left, and so worth protecting. And of course, the reason we have wildlife like grizzly bears and wolves is because we've got so much land that has been protected, or is at least in a roadless condition. But
absolutely, you can't have great hunting and fishing if you don't have healthy headwaters and good habitat for wildlife. And hunting and fishing is a major economic engine in Montana.
There was one issue that brought us together back in the day related to the Gallatin National Forest and the legacy of checkerboard inholdings from the old railroad days, and the Gallatin Range, which is the largest unprotected range in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, National Forest roadless lands, was threatened by development of a certain developer named Tim Blixeth, who we probably remember kind of fondly. I don't know about that, but the threat of development in the core of the Gallatin Range prompted the public, and you heard from them from our part of the world, to demand consolidation of the public lands. And you responded by putting together a really complicated land exchange bill. Can you talk about why that mattered to you?
Well, it was a bit of a Hobson's choice, because Tim Blixeth, or his company, owned a lot of that land north of Yellowstone, and he was bound and determined he was gonna harvest it. And I don't know if I had the idea or somebody gave the idea to me. You forget through the years, but in any event, I said to him, Tim, can we arrange an air flight for you so that you can fly over Yellowstone? and put yourself in the paws of those animals.
Wow.
And see whether you think they need a little more roaming room than they might have just within the park. And he came back, asked to see me right away, and said, "You're right. You're right. Where can I go? What could I trade for? I'm not giving it away."
Right.
And we traded him for the area up around Big Sky, Lone Mountain, some of which is where the private club is now. So, yeah, which he started. But all in all, I think it was a pretty good trade, and I think concepts such as the Greater Yellowstone, or for that matter, the Greater Yosemite, which almost doesn't exist, or the Greater Glacier, which almost doesn't exist, are really good concepts.
Yeah.
I know people don't want to. Some people don't want to broaden the boundaries of our national parks, but we can be careful with regard to zoning the buffers, the landscape buffer around those parks.
Right. Absolutely. Well, and that brings up another issue that we worked on many moons ago, which was protecting the hot water aquifer around Yellowstone Park. So, in their wisdom, Congress in 1872 didn't know where the hot water was that fueled the geysers, and we woke up one day in the mid-'80s to realize this Church Universal and Triumphant had drilled and was potentially going to affect Yellowstone. So it sort of made the larger point that we have to protect, have a bigger vision of landscape protection than simply the boundaries of the park.
Yeah. I made the statement somewhere in the Congress. I suppose I was in a committee hearing at the time, and I said, "Look, I intend." Well, there were some questions about why was I interested in the hot water drilling outside of Yellowstone Park, and I made the statement that I intend to protect Yellowstone Park and to protect it in an ironclad, copper-riveted way, legislative way. And Mo Udall, the former, God bless him, the former chairman of the Interior Committee, knew I was from Butte, and he said into the microphone, "You'll notice, members and staff and audience, that Pat Williams always includes copper-riveted in everything he..." But you can't allow drilling outside of the first national park or hot water features. You can't draw. We don't know where all that hydrology goes.
Right.
And the Church Universal Triumphant and Guru Ma, who's dead now, bless her, but I got to know her. Yeah. And they were snuggled right up against the park. Geologically, they were right up against it and doing their drilling. If they'd have gotten away with that geothermal drilling, others were standing by ready to pounce and do their own drilling.
Absolutely, and we're already sort of getting a sense of that out of Gardner.
Yeah.
That, it wouldn't take very much to open the floodgates.
So when there are those kind of dangers, I just think you stop them when you see them.
Well, you did stop them. And,
we did.
And there was no way the state of Montana at that time was going to stop them, and it was one of those issues that Congress had to act, and you saw it, and you did it. It was incredibly successful.
Fortunate.
So, thank you for that.
Yes.
Yeah, another, while I'm on it, issues that we worked together on was the gold mine proposed at the doorstep of Yellowstone Park in the heart of great grizzly bear habitat, wolf habitat, headwaters of 3 major rivers. The project was opposed by the local community, of course, in Cook City, but that was a very tiny community, but also the Park Service weighed in, EPA eventually got involved, and finally the Clinton administration said that they wanted to help stop this company from proceeding, but of course the Clinton administration turned to you and asked for your advice and your direction, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that campaign. Was there anything surprising in that effort to you?
I was a little surprised, and shouldn't have been, but I was a little surprised with how earnest Bill Clinton, President Clinton, was about protecting the park at that moment. How absolutely determined he became. I didn't go to him and explain it to him. Others did, and then he had Katie McGinty, one of the leading environmental staff people in the administration, get in touch with me, and privately and quietly we began to put a deal together to stop the mine and get them out of there. And but it was Bill Clinton's. Bill Clinton called me twice.
Wow.
And said, "Pat, what are you doing up there about this? We got to." This was after we had moved on it.
Oh, wow.
And he wanted to know, he said, "We're not keeping the effort a secret anymore." They kept it a secret in the beginning so they wouldn't have a lot of people on both sides of the issue flying blind at it. And but even after that, he would call me and say, "Is the park okay? Is that mine gone yet?" And so he was really in it.
Well, he clearly was into it. His final speech in the celebration, some places are more valuable than gold, and Yellowstone's one of those.
Oh, yeah, wonderful. I'd forgotten that.
He was really enthusiastic. But it took a village. I mean, it took everybody, from the tiny town of Cook City to the Park Service and you and the president to stop that. I mean, that was one lesson I learned, that the tremendous amount of power behind the mining industry. In case we had any doubt, of course, you're from Butte, so you never had any doubt.
Well, as you know, public law has stood all these years that it says, in effect, the highest and best use of the public's land is mining.
Yep.
We tried to knock that silly notion down in mining reform bills that we could never quite get passed.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so insane. The same year the Yellowstone Park was protected, they passed the 1872 mine law, and it pretty much gives carte blanche to mining companies across the country, and they don't have to pay any royalties or anything. The public doesn't benefit from what's done on public land. What do you think is good? I mean, you tried to reform it. Certainly Congressman Udall did. Other people sort of threw themselves into the gears of reforming that law. Well, what's it going to take?
Well, mining was more prominent back then, and so their lobby was more effective.
Right.
I actually think now you'd have a better chance of changing that law to make sense out of it than we did then.
Yeah. You need to get
I think it could be done.
Congress, but
you got to get. People got to throw themselves across the tracks for these things.
Right.
I mean, you literally. In some places, you have to put your own career on the line and say, no, we're going to do this. Go home and explain it to people so they know what their member, House or Senate are doing, but do it. And that's the trick. And I think without that real heavy employment base that mining had for so many years in the West, without that, they don't have those workers to push in the center of the poker table.
Right.
You see what I mean? Those chips are gone to them now. Productivity. It isn't that they don't still mine, it's that they don't use people much to do it anymore.
Technology and the streamlining of the industry. Right. Interesting. That's a good point. But throwing yourself on the tracks, it's a lot to ask people to do. So you chose to leave Congress in 1997. Why?
Oh, I thought, primarily I missed home. People that know the West, and I think particularly Montana, maybe we're parochial about it, but I think people that know Montana and leave it are homesick all their lives. And Carol and I were both very homesick in Montana. And our children all decided to go to school out here when they were old enough to be off on their own. So there was something about the Williams family in Montana, and we were attracted by it. And so homesickness primarily brought me home. I also had, when I started thinking about I want to go home because I was homesick, then my mind turned to, what would I do if I came home? Well, I'm a teacher by profession. I thought, I'd go to the university or Montana State, one of the colleges, and teach about what had happened in Washington while I was still young enough to remember what had happened in Washington. And so, and Carol was delighted to be coming back home.
Absolutely.
So home I came. I couldn't There were several times in my career, I'll just tell you this story as a kind of a good story. You may have heard it before somewhere, but there were a couple of attempts to have me come home prior to the time I did and run for governor.
Oh, right.
Yeah, and a major attempt in the very early 90s. And at that time, I had talked to a lot of people and got a lot of conflicting ideas, and I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll go see Mike Mansfield. And so Mike was, I guess he was home from Japan by then, or had he not gone yet? No, I think he was back home. Yeah. And I went to see him. And he asked me, just, he was totally impassive.
Right.
He sat there and just looked at me, nodded, asked permission to smoke his pipe, and I said, oh, sure, that'd be all right with me, Mike, as long as you blow some my way. He thought that was comical. I got a little half smile out of him. Yeah. And he said to me, well, do you think you want to go on to the Senate, Pat? I said, nope. And you really want to be governor? And I said, well, I'm not sure if I want to be governor or I want to be in Montana. But I told people I wouldn't use the House as a stepping stone to run for anything else. I promised people that, and it's hard for me to break that promise. So we talked about it back and forth, and it was all kind of, I'm sure, just sort of quizzical to him. And then he said to me, all right, Pat, I'll tell you what you ought to do. He put the pipe back in the ashtray. And he said, you do what I always did at times like this in my life. You go ask your wife. He said, your wife cares more about you and Montana than anyone else in the world. He said, I know your mom Libby's dead now. So he knew everybody. Yeah. So he said, he said, you go ask Carol, and then consider her advice more than anybody's. And with that, he got up and said, Pat, I'm glad you came. It's nice to see you. The meeting was over.
Hurrah.
As I was going down the hallway, he had forgotten to say goodbye to me, so I heard him yell, Pat. And I turned around from a distance of about 30 feet, and he said, with the end of his pipe kind of half pointing at me, he said, tap her light. That was his thing, from his days working in the mines in Butte. That was the last time I ever saw Mike.
Really?
Yeah.
How old was he then? I mean,
he was probably 91 or 2, maybe. Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
I mean, we've been blessed in Montana with...
Marvelous.
You included.
Well, I don't know, but thank you.
Mike Mansfield and Lee Metcalf.
Yeah. And early on, Jeanette and many others, B.K. Wheeler and others. Yeah.
Well, one of my early trips back to Washington, you took me and a couple others to see the Jeanette Rankin statue, which we never would have found on our own. Yeah. By the way.
Yeah.
And it was quite the moment. She is quite the.
I met Jeanette. I met her. I opened up the Washington Post one day, and above the fold was a story on the front page. There was a photo on the front page that said, and in the photo was some women carrying a banner, a huge banner, all the way across the street, Pennsylvania Avenue. And the banner said the Jeanette Rankin Brigade. And there was this little woman who I thought was dead, who looked like and was Jeanette Rankin at the head of the group. And, oh my God. Yeah. And so I got to know her. And
oh my gosh.
I asked her one time, I said, Jeanette, what do you want to be most remembered for? And she said, well, of course, everybody thinks it's the war. And she said, I'd vote against both wars again if I had the chance. Yeah. But she said, Pat, my life is about equality. It's always been about equity.
Interesting.
She said, if war broke out and I was to vote for it, she said a lot of things would happen that violated equality and equity. And the most important to me was that my brother, Wellington, would have had to go and would have had to have gone and fight. Yeah. And I couldn't. And she took one hand in both of her hands and she said, Pat, that's not fair.
Wow.
And I've told that to several historians, but I never see it as a reason for her vote no.
I've never heard that.
Right. I love that story.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about another person who was prescient. And,
yeah, she was. Yeah.
Yeah, Well, what's it like, after all your many years in Congress and in politics, to look at the current administration, the current Congress? What's it like to look at D.C. from the distance of Montana? What do you think the Trump administration is doing to our civil society, and what's the way out of this predicament?
Well, one of the first things I learned on coming home, when I was a watcher and a listener instead of a creator from Washington, D.C., I've always been a Congress buff, knew what was going on there. But as I got back home, I tried to look and listen and figure out what is the difference between what you know is going on in Congress and what the constituency suppose is going on in Congress, what they think we're doing back there. Mm-hmm. So now suddenly I was a constituent again and just able to view it that way. Yeah. And what I kind of picked up is really too long for any interview, but essentially it was that people see politics in a kind of a shorthand. They hear a slogan, they see a rumor, they pick something up and they make a judgment out of it. Mm-hmm. And that's okay, because we're not a democracy, we're a republic where people vote for others to go do the business of government for them. And so it's okay that we're a little removed. Frankly, public has become too far removed and don't know enough about it. But I began to get a much better sense of why there is this reality gap, information gap between the government and its people, the Congress and the voters. Mm-hmm. So that's been interesting. With regard to the current administration, I know Donald Trump personally. I've been with him over a 4 or 5 hour couple of time periods, and I think the president is. I think the president is mentally disabled. He is so narcissistic, so much about Donald Trump, that everything in his life revolves around him. Mm-hmm. And I don't think he can get out from under that. I think it's an illness with him. Mm-hmm. And having a president who thinks the presidency, and Bill Clinton used to say, well, the first thing I noticed when I left the presidency was they don't play that tune anymore when I enter the room. Right. Well, Donald Trump will never get over that, down to playing that tune when he enters the room. My God, that'd be a terrible blow for him. Bill Clinton's kidding about it. Trump takes this stuff with regard to his own power. He takes it far, far too seriously. He thinks that that's why he wants a parade, right? This. Military, he thinks it's all about him. Right. And so I worry about the country with Donald Trump in charge. And I worry about a country where as many citizens voted for him as did. I worry about those folks. Mm-hmm. Some of them are friends of mine, but troubled.
I've got some too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. They all do. Yeah, so what's your suggestion? I'm sure that students at the University of Montana who you run into, look to you for guidance. What would what's your suggestion to younger people? Just in terms of...
Well, get in it. Get in it. Some way or other, get your feet wet. One of the first members of Congress was a fellow from Massachusetts named Fisher Ames. Fisher Ames kept a diary, and that's how one of the primary ways we know what occurred in the first Congress, is he had these pretty good notes. Uh-huh. And we also have letters that he wrote home. People in those days were great letter writers.
Right.
And in one of the letters as the Congress had adjourned its first session, Fisher Ames wrote home to a friend and said, well, this is really going to be something. It's not our government is not going to be a tall sailing ship like the British government. It isn't going to be very pretty. It's not going to ride high on the waves. But sailing ships usually come aground on the rocks. And if all hands aren't lost, the ship is. He said, no, this ship isn't going to, our ship of state isn't going to be like that at all. It's a raft. And he said, it's not going to move very fast. And we're going to have a lot of trouble stopping it or turning it, either one.
Yeah.
He said, the best thing about a raft is everybody on board gets their feet wet.
Wow.
I encourage my students and young people, get your feet wet.
Right.
Even if you only read the paper every day.
Right.
But you can do more than that. You can register to vote. You get some other people to register to vote. You can listen to speeches. You can go to campaign rallies. You can read about things. Get your feet wet.
Right.
And several of them, by the way, have run for public office and then told me or their friends, I'm only doing this to get my feet wet. So I appreciate that.
The story's getting retold.
Yeah.
And other people getting their feet wet. That's great. Well, so state wildlife wasn't really your wheelhouse as a congressman.
Management of it, yeah.
But you're back in Montana and have been now for decades and obviously interested. And we have a number of species that people really care about that are hugely controversial.
Right.
You know, bison that are getting slaughtered outside Yellowstone Park right now. Grizzly bears that have been delisted around Yellowstone and maybe soon up in Glacier. You know, wolves certainly, which, you know, when you were a congressman, wolves were brought back to Yellowstone, which was an amazing event. And there is a lot of confusion and controversy about how the states, and I'm not just talking about Montana here, but how Western states tend to view wildlife. And it gets to this issue of who owns wildlife, you know, whether it's just people within the state of Montana or you know, the broader national public, and should the states be considering the larger public interest. What's your suggestions about how, I mean, do you think state wildlife management could be improved? And if so, what do you think, what are your suggestions?
I don't have prescriptions. I'm not close enough to it. I do think that vast acreages of Montana need to be preserved under one type of designation or management scheme or another in order that these animals have appropriate habitat and maneuvering room.
Right.
And that means you've got to use a lot of public land.
Right.
We've got to allow these animals to use a lot of public land.
Indeed.
Otherwise, it seems to me that's number one. If we don't do that, I worry about it. What was the name of the rogue wolf? Was it Molly Brown? You remember the rogue wolf in Yellowstone? They recaptured and put her in the pen, and they called her Molly Brown because she had 2 kids but no dad.
Oh, yeah.
Somebody shot the alpha male.
Yeah, right.
I went to see Molly Brown one time in the pen. I went with Bob Barbie, bless his soul.
Yes.
And one of the great experiences of my life is a huge pen in an unknown location in Yellowstone.
Yeah.
And the superintendent and I and a wildlife biologist with a leg of lamb over his shoulder, we walked in there and fed her by throwing the leg of lamb over. She had her pups down in a little concealed area within the pen that the Park Service had built for her.
Yeah.
And this wolf, this female wolf, a couple of years old, was pacing back and forth against the far fence with her tongue hanging well below her jaw.
Whoa.
And the look in her eyes, it looked as though there was a candle behind both eyes that glimmered and sparked and moved around as on a breezy day.
Yeah.
Right? I realized it's the epitome of wildness for me.
Yeah.
That was the most wild thing I'd ever seen. Well, if those things, whether they're grizzly bears or woodpeckers or wolves, are going to be protected, we've got to give them a home in which they can be protected.
Right.
And that's, in Montana, that means public land.
Right.
So the only suggestion I have about managing, because I'm far from an expert even close to it in that, is space.
But the habitat issue, the world is getting smaller day by day. More and more people are flocking to this part of the world, buying land, starting, a chicken farm, and then wondering why grizzly bears are in their chickens and stuff like that. So, I mean, there is a kind of erosion, steady erosion of the public land space. And it's no accident that we have these species here in Montana where we have so much public land.
Right.
But,
no accident, right.
It gets back to where we started this conversation, which was, are we going to protect our, wilderness legacy or not?
Right. And you mentioned whose animals are these? In my view, these animals belong to the world, but certainly to all Americans. And it does seem to me that this may be an area for the Congress to step into and make a determination as to who animals are these and who should manage them and how should they be managed and what group of people should have a say in that management. Right? Now, I personally think that the little I know about management, and I've dealt with managers and go out to see how they do it and all that, but the little I know about it says to me that state managers, the people on the ground, be they federal or state officials, are, of course, a better way to do it. But that doesn't mean that the federal government can't have a more important role than it now has in the stewardship of the animals that, for the moment, happen to be in Montana.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's an interesting idea because many of us have talked for a long time about what other ways to protect, what other ways are there to protect wildlife if you're not listed as endangered.
Right.
But there's still a species of national significance. Is there some other mechanism that we put into place that does give the broader national public a say? I mean, that's kind of what we're getting to.
Yeah, I am. I'm trying to get to some different type of a critique and then a management style with federal authority in it. Now, I know states ruffle about that, but land managers can get along, and you can draw the laws in ways that I think most people would agree.
That's really an interesting and exciting idea. I mean, it's been around, but I haven't heard it in a long time, and not in the way that you're presenting it right now. So that's great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Pat, for taking the time